Hello, and welcome to the deep dive from Westferry Times. Today, we're tackling a really significant issue for UK industry, the bite that carbon taxes are taking out of our manufacturing sector. You've probably seen the headlines. Sir Jim Ratcliffe of INEOS has been particularly outspoken recently, saying that these taxes are, and I quote, killing manufacturing in Britain.
It's certainly a strong statement, isn't it?
I
And one that, well, it reflects a growing concern within energy-intensive industries
About the costs.
about the impact of these added costs, yeah,
Mhm.
on their competitiveness and, crucially, future investment.
Absolutely. To really unpick what's happening here, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Thomas Reed. Dr. Reed is a highly respected industrial economist and a former advisor to the UK Department for Business and Trade. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Our mission today is pretty laser focused. We want to get a clear understanding of the real financial strain, that these carbon taxes are putting on UK manufacturers. So let's dive straight in. Can you maybe give us the lowdown on the UK emissions trading scheme, the ETS? What's it actually designed to achieve?
Okay, sure. The UK ETS is essentially a market-based mechanism. It's designed to reduce the overall emissions of greenhouse gases from, well, key sectors of the economy.
Like a cap.
Exactly. Think of it as the government setting a limit, a cap, on the total amount of these gases that can be released. Then companies that fall under the scheme either get given or must purchase allowances for each ton of carbon dioxide they emit.
Allowances. Okay.
And a crucial aspect is that these allowances can actually be traded between companies.
Oh, okay.
Fundamental idea is, well, to make emitting carbon more expensive. So it creates a financial incentive for businesses to figure out ways to cut their emissions.
Yeah.
Efficiently, hopefully.
Okay, so for manufacturers, say, on the ground floor, how does this translate into real-world impact? What does it mean day to day?
Well, for manufacturers, especially those in really energy-intensive sectors like steel, chemicals, cement, the ETS introduces a direct carbon cost right into their operations.
A direct cost.
Yes. If the emissions from their production processes go over the number of allowances they hold, well, they're obligated to buy more, additional allowances.
And those cost money, obviously.
They do. And the market price for these allowances fluctuates, which adds a variable but potentially significant cost to their bottom line. This is especially true for industries that rely heavily on fossil fuels for energy or whose core processes just inherently produce a lot of carbon emissions. It's quite fascinating, really, how this abstract thing, an emissions allowance, directly hits the balance sheet of a factory.
Right, it's not just theoretical money, it's a real increase in their day-to-day running costs. We're hearing a lot of anxiety from industry about this. What are some of the main challenges this carbon pricing is posing for them?
The most immediate challenge, the one they feel most keenly, is undoubtedly the jump in operational expenditure, the OPEX.
That INEOS figure you mentioned.
Exactly. The figure you mentioned earlier, INEOS reporting, what was it, a 15 million pound carbon emissions bill for their Grangemouth plant just for 2024.
Wow.
That really brings the scale of these costs into sharp focus, doesn't it? Especially for the major industrial players. These kinds of substantial outlays can, well, they can divert significant capital. Money that could have gone into upgrading facilities or adopting more energy-efficient tech.
Yeah.
It does raise an important question. Is this the best way to incentivize that green investment, or does it sort of accidentally hinder it in the short term?
And it almost feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? You're trying to encourage green initiatives, but the cost of current emissions might actually make those future investments harder to justify financially.
Precisely. That immediate financial squeeze can sometimes lead companies to postpone or maybe even scrap investments in energy efficiency projects. Projects that would, in the long run, cut both their emissions and their carbon tax bills.
Right.
And there's also this other significant, quite complex issue. It's known as carbon leakage.
Carbon leakage. Okay, what's that?
Imagine a water tank with a hole in it. If you try to reduce the pressure in one area, say the UK, with its carbon taxes, the water, which is production in this analogy, might just leak out.
Out to where?
To another area, countries maybe without such taxes or with much lower ones.
Ah, okay. So it's the risk of companies basically upping sticks and moving production somewhere with less stringent environmental rules.
That's exactly it. Faced with rising carbon costs here in the UK, companies might decide it's cheaper to shift production overseas to countries with weaker or maybe no carbon pricing at all.
Which doesn't really help the planet overall.
Not at all. While it could lower the UK's reported emissions on paper, It doesn't solve the global climate challenge.
Yeah.
It could even make things worse if those other countries have less efficient production methods. Plus, it has serious potential consequences for UK jobs and our manufacturing base.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, it really highlights the need for some kind of international coordination on these carbon pricing mechanisms.
Yeah. Let's maybe drill down into that specific case we mentioned earlier, INEOS and their Grangemouth facility. What exactly has been the reaction to these carbon taxes? What have they actually done?
Well, INEOS has been very, very vocal about the impact, what they see as the detrimental impact of the carbon tax on Grangemouth. They've actually made the decision to pause several planned energy efficiency projects.
Pause them.
Yes, put them on hold. And they've explicitly cited the financial burden from the ETS as a primary reason. These weren't minor things either. They included important initiatives like waste heat recovery systems.
Which reuse wasted heat. Right.
Exactly, capture and reuse heat that would otherwise just vent into the atmosphere. And also condensate recovery upgrades, which are designed to improve both water and energy efficiency inside the plant.
So hang on, just to be clear. Projects specifically designed to make them greener, more efficient, are being put on hold because of the cost associated with their current carbon emissions. That sounds like a real bind.
It is. It's a genuine dilemma. From INEOS's perspective, the current carbon tax regime is basically siphoning off crucial capital. Capital that they argue is needed for those very investments required for long-term sustainability. So instead of putting funds towards lowering their carbon footprint in the future, they're forced to spend significant sums just to operate right now under the existing rules. It brings up a really important point. What's the right pace for bringing in these kinds of carbon costs? How do you ensure a smooth transition without, crippling vital industries in the process?
And the consequences of pausing these specific projects, they surely extend beyond just INEOS, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. The decision to halt these kinds of investments, it has much broader implications for the UK's environmental goals, for our industrial future.
Yes.
Well, it signals a potential slowdown in the move towards more sustainable industrial practices overall. It could also mean missed opportunities for quite significant reductions in the UK's total emissions. And it might negatively impact the long-term competitiveness, maybe even the viability of the Grangemouth facility itself, which of course has potential knock-on effects for jobs and the regional economy.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It really underscores that deep link between environmental policy and industrial strategy that can't really be separated.
So given all this, what's the UK government's thinking here? They brought in the ETS for specific reasons, didn't they? What's their rationale?
The UK government's position is pretty clear. They see the ETS as an indispensable tool, a key lever for driving the green investment needed to hit the UK's legally binding net zero emissions targets.
So they see it as a driver, not a hindrance.
Exactly. Their argument is that by putting a clear price on carbon emissions, the scheme acts as a powerful incentive for innovation right across the economy. It sort of compels companies to actively look for and adopt cleaner technologies and processes. Why? To lower their emissions and therefore lower their carbon costs.
Makes sense from that perspective.
They view it as a fundamental way to encourage companies to internalize the environmental costs of what they do, to proactively pursue decarbonization. And importantly, the government is also planning to introduce something called a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, that's slated for 2027.
Okay, the CBAM, we touched on that risk of carbon leakage earlier. Can you explain a bit more about how this CBAM thing is supposed to work?
Sure. The CBAM is essentially going to be a levy, a charge applied to certain carbon-intensive goods when they're imported into the UK, things like steel, cement.
So taxing imports based on their carbon footprint.
Broadly, yes. The core idea is to make sure that these imports face a carbon price that's roughly equivalent to the carbon price UK producers are facing under our ETS. By doing that, by creating a more level playing field, the government aims to prevent that carbon leakage we talked about.
Right. Stop the incentive to just move production.
Exactly, and protect UK industries from being unfairly disadvantaged by competition from countries that maybe have less strict climate policies and therefore lower carbon costs. Of course, it does raise an interesting practical question. How effectively can you actually measure and verify the embedded carbon in all these different imported goods?
Yeah, that sounds tricky. But the goal is clear. Incentivize cleaner production globally and remove that temptation for UK manufacturers to simply relocate to avoid carbon costs here.
That's precisely the objective, yes. By making imported goods from those carbon-heavy sectors bear a comparable carbon cost, the CBAM seeks to encourage cleaner production practices worldwide and, crucially, reduce the competitive disadvantage faced by UK manufacturers who are operating under the ETS.
How does the UK's plan here compare internationally? Are other countries doing similar things?
Yes, definitely. The UK is part of a growing global trend towards carbon pricing mechanisms. It's not acting in isolation. The European Union, for instance, is planning to implement its own CBAM, but they're scheduled for 2026.
Ah, a year ahead of the UK's plan.
That's right,
Yeah.
a year earlier than the UK's current timeline of 2027. And this difference in timing has actually raised some concerns among UK industry groups
Concerns about
about a potential competitive disadvantage. They worry they might be exposed to unfair competition, particularly in the EU market, during that interim year before the UK CBAM kicks in.
that makes sense. Being a year behind could leave them vulnerable, potentially. Are there other global examples of carbon pricing?
Oh, absolutely. Many countries and regions around the world have already put in place or are actively exploring carbon pricing in different forms. Some use emissions trading schemes like the UK and EU. Others use direct carbon taxes. The common challenge for all of them, really, is striking that right balance
The balance between
between pursuing ambitious environmental goals, fighting climate change, and at the same time, safeguarding the economic competitiveness of their own domestic industries. Especially in today's very interconnected global marketplace, the really delicate balancing act. Huge economic and environmental implications either way.
So, Dr. Reed, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are your key takeaways? Any recommendations for navigating this pretty complex landscape of carbon taxes and manufacturing here in the UK?
Well, I think the crucial takeaway for me is the absolute need for a carefully calibrated, balanced approach. It's vital. While carbon pricing mechanisms like the ETS are, I believe, vital tools for driving decarbonization and hitting those net zero targets, their implementation needs to be managed really carefully.
Yep, so.
Managed in a way that avoids disproportionately burdening domestic manufacturers and avoids triggering those unintended consequences we discussed, like carbon leakage.
So, what might that look like in practice?
Well, it could involve providing targeted transitional support, helping industries invest in and adopt the greener technologies and processes they need. Also, fostering ongoing meaningful dialogue. Really engaging with industry stakeholders is essential to make sure these policies are effective, but also fair. You don't want to create undue competitive disadvantages.
And technology.
Absolutely. Continued investment in R&D, the development and deployment of innovative green technologies is paramount. That's what will ultimately empower industries to cut their emissions in a way that's sustainable, but also economically viable.
Some really valuable insights there. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us on the deep dive today.
My pleasure. It was a very interesting discussion indeed.
And thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us for this deep dive into what is really a critical issue for UK manufacturing. If you found this discussion valuable, please do think about subscribing to Westferry Times so you don't miss our future explorations of important topics like this. It certainly gives you food for thought, doesn't it? That central question: how can we best balance our vital environmental ambitions with the absolute imperative of maintaining a strong, competitive manufacturing sector in this globalized economy? Until our next deep dive, take care. Thank you for watching Westferry Times.